me the story of Jesus, write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read what you whisper, love in the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, this morning I'm going to bring a lesson that was actually, it's part of a series that was done by Pastor Mott in Detroit. He just finished about a 5 or 6 week series on the pros and cons of non-resident membership. There was one chunk in there, and I've already run this by him, and he said, feel free to use it. It's my lumber, but you can build your own chicken coop out of it, and that's what I intend to do. There was one chunk in there that was really good and really applicable to our situation here, especially now that we have actually more non-resident members than we have resident members. Of course, now Rex and Diana, that counts you until we get you down here next year, and that counts Blake and Josh, which, you know, hopefully before too long they'll be with us here also, and then the tables will switch. But in the meantime, we're pretty top heavy with non-resident members. And so this message that I want to bring you today, it's basically 2 verses that we're going to analyze. And it shows what a church should look like, what God's church should look like, and how to help the church get to that point. To increase with the increase that God wants, not the increase that man wants, but with the increase of God. To grow the way that God wants a church to grow. Those are the verses. Now the first verse that we're going to look at is Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16. I have to warn you, it may seem a bit complex, but we will break it down. And we will break it down in light of another verse that says much the same thing in a little bit different wording. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16 says, from whom, now if you look at verse 15, you'll find out who the whom is. The whom is the head, even Christ, in verse 15. So from whom, we're talking about Christ. From whom the whole body, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Pretty simple, right? Yeah, well, we're going to go through it bit by bit. Now we're going to look at it. There's another verse that we're going to compare this with that gives us a little bit more information to it, and that's Colossians chapter 2 and verse 19. And that verse says, and not holding the head, and again the head is Jesus Christ, from which all the body by joints and bands having nourishment ministered and knit together increaseth with the increase of God. Again, very simple, right? Good old simple English. But we're going to work our way through it, not to be afraid of that. Now, when we're talking about this whole body, Ephesians 4:16, the whole body fitly joined together. The whole body under consideration in the context is the local church. The local church. That's what we're talking about. Now let's show that from Scripture. First, I want you to turn to Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15, where we're dealing with the church at Jerusalem. Acts chapter 15 and verse 22. Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church. You see, the whole church, that's the whole body. And we're talking about here the church at Jerusalem, which doesn't exist anymore and hasn't existed for a very long time. And we're going to see why next week. Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, named Barsabbas, and Silas, chief men among the brethren. So here we have the whole church in Jerusalem. But now compare this to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And I know I've gone over this a lot of times before with a lot more verses, so I don't need to kill a dead horse this morning, but I just want to show the point what the whole church is. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 23 says, if therefore the whole church be come together into one place. Now, again, the whole church. Now he's writing to the church at Corinth, referring to the whole church. And if the whole church be gathered together into one place, is it possible to gather the entire universal church of Christ together into one place? Not on this earth it isn't, because we've lived at different times. You can't go back to the 1600s and find the people that were members of the church and bring them into this room today. Well, I guess you could if you wanted to dig them up and bring in a bunch of skeletons, but we'd probably be arrested for health violations. You see, if the whole church be gathered into one place, there is a time when that will happen, but that's not here on earth. That's in heaven. Here on earth, the whole church refers to each and every individual assembly. What is in this room right now is the whole church of Christ on this planet. Now, there's another one in Detroit that Pastor Mott ministers to, but that's the whole church also. Each individual congregation is the whole church. That's the point. If it gets down to the point to where there's only one church left on the face of the earth, Christ's church is still here. What we have, when you look at the letter to the Galatians, he refers to the churches, plural, of God. You see, there was more than one in that geographical location. Here we have, this is the whole church. The church in Detroit is the whole church in Detroit. The one in Cincinnati is the whole church in Cincinnati. And if something were to happen to this church or to one of those that they cease to be a church, the whole church is still in existence in these other places. That's the reason. Remember, the church at Jerusalem that was the whole church isn't there anymore. The church at Corinth isn't there anymore. Churches don't live forever. Churches come and churches go, just like human beings. They start young, they grow, they eventually mature and then pass out of life, and another church pops up somewhere else. But this is not some form of a hierarchical system where you have the big head that then stretches down with all these little tentacles. No, each individual congregation is all that matters. Each one is the whole church of Christ. Each one is the whole church of God. This congregation within these four walls is the whole church, except it also includes our non-resident members. Non-resident members are just as much a part of the church as the people that have access to this room week after week after week. Now, I come from a little bit different background than a lot of the ministers, in that Wendy and I spent a quarter of a century as non-resident members. Therefore, I have probably a little more empathy for non-resident members than some of the other ministers. It's one of the reasons that I was willing to take in the people from Las Vegas, because I know what it's like to be a non-resident member. I know it really, really well, okay? And that's one of the reasons that I'm bringing this sermon today, because this church in this room, you're going to see that we fit a lot of what we're going to cover today, but our non-resident members should fit here as well. They should be just as much a part of this church as we are. They have every right to be just as much of a member and a part of this church as we have here in the room. The only difference is they don't live here. And I'm going to tell you something. There's a lot more that goes on in this room than there is sitting in front of a television set. And you can ask the man in the blue shirt back there. Even though they watch us weekly, he's told me over and over again, it's different when you walk in the room, and we're going to cover a little bit as to why on the message today as well. So understand that when we talk about this whole body, we're talking about the whole church, which includes resident and non-resident members alike. It includes us all. Now, I'm going to chase a rabbit for a couple of minutes here. I want you to turn to Psalm chapter 107. Because, and this is for all of those people out there that are non-resident members, which we'll probably see this next week. Psalms chapter 7, or 107, verse 4. They wandered in the wilderness in a solitary way. They found no city to dwell in. Now that describes a non-resident member. You think about some of them that are out there where there's only one person in the entire state wandering around in the wilderness, trying to find a place, but there is no place, there's no city. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted in them. Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them out of their distresses. Sometimes God will do something like he did here in Lakeland, Florida. There were 4 non-resident members of the Meadows Church that had never even met each other. 2 of them lived in Plant City. 2 of them lived in Auburndale. And what happened? God raised up a church. God answered their prayers and raised up a church. You never know where and when God might raise up a church. If you have several non-resident members in an area that are serving him faithfully and praying for him, God could raise up a church. God could start another church in Las Vegas for all we know. He could start one anywhere that he decides he wants to start one. Let's be prayerful that he does so that those people don't have to be non-resident members forever. That's one thing that God can do. And he's done it, and we're witnesses of it here in this room. But there's something else that he can do. Verse 7, and he led them forth by the right way that they might go to a city of habitation. He might open a door to help them to move to somewhere that there's already a church. And he's done that before. And we all know that. We have a couple sitting here now that are trying to that are non-resident members trying to make plans to move here. We have one of my sons that's feverishly trying to make plans to move to where there's a church. Wendy and I fell into the 3rd category. We prayed constantly and did everything we could to try to kick down a door and couldn't get a door to open because of the 3rd category. And that is that sometimes God just leaves you out there for whatever reason. We don't know. We can't fathom why. We can't understand why. But sometimes there are non-resident members that spend their entire life on this world being non-resident members. That happens. And while we don't know why, there's something else we have to consider, and that's we're going to find in Romans chapter 11 and verse 33. We don't have the right to ask why. God, we have no issues with sovereign grace, with the idea that God gets involved in salvation and that he's sovereign in that. But then sometimes we do have issues with him being sovereign in other areas. This is an area where he is also sovereign, and he may make that decision that somebody has to spend their entire Christian experience outside of the church as a non-resident member. Sometimes that happens. Romans chapter 11 and verse 33. Says, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out." Sometimes we just have no way of knowing. We can't tell for one reason or another why God would leave somebody out there. But he does, and he has. He's done it before. He can do it again, and it's he that has the right to make that decision. In Job chapter 33 And verse 13. It says, "Why dost thou strive against him? For he giveth not account of any of his matters." We may get down on our knees and ask why, but don't expect God to answer. He might, but he might not as well, and that's his right to do. He doesn't have to give an account to us for anything. And he has given us everything that he intends to give us right here within his book. If you turn over to Daniel, chapter 4 and verse 35. "And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou?" You see, sometimes God works in ways that we don't understand, and we just have to live with it. So the three things that God can do to for a non-resident member is he can raise up a church where they are. He can open a door to help them to move to somewhere where there's another church. Maybe a job opens up that would help them to go somewhere where there is a church. Maybe something else. Well, he killed two birds with one rock in the case of Wendy and I. He started a church in Lakeland and then called us to come down here. So he got us out of our non-resident membership situation and started a church for y'all. So you see, he can do it both ways, but you never know when. You might have to be like Wendy and me and wander around out in the wilderness for a quarter of a century. It might be your lot. And so to the non-resident members that are out there, be prayerful that one of the other two will happen. But if it doesn't, and if you end up out in the wilderness for the rest of your Christian experience, know that you're not alone. Know that there is a church here. Know that we are accessible. And in this day and age, since we're able to minister through a media, I can only imagine what it was like 100 years ago when we didn't have cameras. We didn't even have tape. What did you do then? You see, it would have been harder then than it is now. So at least we have something, but it's still not the same as being in the room. Our group in Las Vegas that meets every Sunday, it's still not the same. Yes, they sing songs and they have prayer and they watch the sermon from the prior week on a television set, but it's still not the same. And we're going to go through why in just a few minutes. Okay. Now, there's one other thing that I want you to see, and this deals with the rabbit that we're chasing, and then we'll get into the verse. There are some obligations that we as church members have to each other, and this is for not just for the people in the room. We do a very good job of this for the people in the room. Now, we just recently got a boatload of non-residents. So over the course of a while, I hope that we'll do better with them as well, because we owe them the same, and they owe us the same as well. So this isn't just all on the people here. This is on them as well. This is reciprocal. This goes for every member of the church. We have obligations as members of the church. And the first is found over in Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2. "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." We're commanded to do that, to bear one another's burdens. And that's not just the folks here. That's the folks there as well, the non-residents as well. When someone is having a problem, it's our responsibility as members of the church to help them with that, to do whatever we can to help them. And it's not just the pastor's job. This is for everybody. Okay? In Romans chapter 12, we have another. Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. says, rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. When someone is having a good experience, we're to be there to rejoice with them, to slap them on the back. And when they're going through a hard time, we're to be there with them as well, to see them through the hard times. That's what we're to do as church members. These are obligations that we have. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 26 says, and whether one member suffer, all the members suffer with it. Or one member be honored, all the members rejoice with it. Remember that the members of the church are like the members of a body, as we're going to see in a few minutes. When I had problems with my right knee, it wasn't just my right knee that suffered, because what happened then was I started favoring my right knee, and my left leg blew out from an earlier injury. That if one part of the body suffers, then the entire body suffers. And if one party rejoices, then the whole body rejoices. And remember that we as church members are like members of a body. If one of our brethren somewhere that's a member of our church, that supports our church, even though he's not in the room, is suffering, we suffer with him. Or we should. We're commanded to. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 14, it says, and I myself also am persuaded of you, my brethren, that ye also are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another. When we see one of our brethren getting into trouble, it's our duty to admonish that brethren, to warn them, to let them know you're good. By the time the pastor gets involved, I hate to say it, it's usually too late. By the time the pastor, because there comes a point in time when the pastor has to get involved. You've seen it. We've had 3 brethren that we've excluded from the church. By the time I make the phone call, it's usually too late. By that time, it's pretty hard to save them. But the brethren in the church have every right to talk to them as well. And we're commanded to do that. We don't live outside in our own little fishbowl anymore. When you're a member of a church, you're a member of the body. And if your leg starts to hurt, you do things to fix your leg. You don't just ignore it until gangrene sets in and it falls off all by itself. We're commanded to admonish one another. Look also at Hebrews chapter 3. We'll see kind of the same thing with a little bit different wording. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 13. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Sin is a terrible thing. And if you start to fall into it, it'll harden your heart. And eventually, you lose the opportunity to save somebody if they get too far involved. So we're told to exhort one another, which is a lot like admonishing one another. Something else we're told over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 14. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 14. It says, now we exhort you, brethren, warn them that are unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak, be patient toward all men. And finally, there's one other thing. There's more than this. I'm just going over a couple of them, but here's a few. These are just a few, and here's the last one we're going to talk about this morning, and that's Job chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. Job 4, 3 and 4. Behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. Thy words have upholden him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. We're to comfort and we're to edify each other. We're to build each other up. We're to help each other get through whatever it is that we're getting through. Okay? Now, we'll leave the rabbit there and we'll get back to back to our text. And our text, Ephesians 4:16, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Now let's go ahead and start breaking this down. This verse is dealing with the body edifying itself. It is the body that edifies itself. The body builds itself up. That's what it says here. Notice, according to the effectual working in the measure of it, making increase of the body unto the edifying of itself. The body edifies itself. The body grows as a result of what the body does. If the body doesn't do anything, there's no growth. The body has to do something in order to grow, and I'm not talking numbers. I'm not talking just numbers of people in a room, as we're going to see later. In many cases, it's preferable to have a smaller number of people in the room. Sometimes a large number of people in the room does exactly the opposite of what God wants. What I'm talking about as far as growth is concerned is that every one of the members of the church grows in those spiritual qualities that we want that makes them a mature Christian. That's the growth we're talking about. And then if God be pleased to help the church to grow in numbers, well, so much the better. If not, it's the spiritual growth that we should be seeking, not simply a growth in numbers. Okay? So this is a verse that's dealing with the body edifying itself. The first place I want you to turn is Romans chapter 14 and verse 19. Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify another. Edify, to mean to build up. To build, so that's what we should be following. We should be looking for things that edify one another. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 2 says, let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. Again, growth, edification, building up. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11 says, wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also you do. You see, the church at Thessalonica was much like the church here. They already did this stuff, and yet the Apostle Paul reminded them to do it. So it's not wrong for me to remind you to do what you're already doing. If the Apostle Paul could do it, then I can do it as well. I'm simply following his pattern. Okay? So we see that the church edifies itself. Now, it does so from Christ. Remember in verse 15, we were talking about the head, even Christ. From Christ, the whole body makes increase of the body. It is from Christ, the head, that the body grows. As we're going to see in a few minutes, it's the nourishment that comes from Christ that strengthens and helps the body to grow. It's not me. I just stand here and tell you what I'm supposed to tell you, but the growth comes from Christ. And that is the reason that it's different in this room than it is watching this on a television set 1,000 miles away. Because on the television set, Christ isn't there. He's here in this room. When you walk out of the door this morning, if you feel nourished, the reason you feel nourished is because Christ nourished you. And we're going to see how he did it as we continue with this study. But it's the head that gives the nourishment. It's not the preacher. It's the head. I simply stand up here and teach you things, but it's Christ funneling through that's connecting all of the pieces to the body together so that they grow and so that they're nourished. And that's why it's different if you sit at home and watch this on a television set, especially if you're by yourself. Okay? So from Christ, the whole body maketh the increase of the body. Now, to make an increase is to cause or to bring about an increase or growth. All the nourishment for the growth of the church derives from Christ. Every bit of it. It comes from Christ, who's the head of the body. Remember, we read over in Colossians 2:19, and not holding the head, from which all the body by joints and bands, having nourishment ministered and knit together, increaseth with the increase of God. It's the head. It comes from Christ. As it's nourished, the whole body brings about the growth of the body. It takes the whole body to do this. And the whole church is needed for the growth of the church. You see, it's God's objective that the church grows together. Now, we're in a situation where we have a whole bunch of people that aren't here. But what I keep instructing them to do is that meet with someone else. At least make it like as much like church as you can when you're out there wandering around by yourself. If there are others in the area that you can get together with on Sunday at 10 o'clock or whenever, pick a day of the week and get together and sing songs like they're doing in Las Vegas, like I hope they're doing in Phoenix, where when you have a group of people, at least you get that group together and have as close to church as you can. That's at least better than just sitting out there by yourself and plopping down on the couch with a cup of coffee and throwing a DVD in the television set and watching a video. That's not church. Christ said, where two or more are gathered in my name, there will I be in the midst. Well, if you're doing it by yourself, there's not two or more of you gathered in his name. Try to put it together, and now I'm speaking to the non-residents. Try to get together as much as you can with other people. Try to make it as much like church as you can. I know it will never be the same as being in the room, but try to make it as close as you can. That's how Christ nourishes the church. Now, we're told that the whole body is fitly joined together. Now let's zero in on those words. Fitly means in a way that is fit. Big surprise there. Well adapted or suited to the conditions or circumstances of the case, answering the purpose. We are fitly joined together. We are put together for a purpose. All the various parts of the body of Christ are made so that they fit together. They're like pieces to a puzzle. They fit together. And I want you to think about that for a minute. All of the members of this church were specifically designed to fit together. You were not designed to fit apart. You were designed to fit together, so that every one of the different parts of this church meld in together. Many times Wendy and I sat around wondering why we were out there for so many years. And we've made the joke before that, well, part of the reason was because we had to wait for y'all to grow up. Because most of you were 9 when we started this, or thereabouts. But you know that's true. Because if God called me to be your pastor, and I believe he did, do you not see that he made sure that my life was arranged in such a way that I would be in the right place at the right time? That he made sure through providence that all of you met at the right time in the right situation so that you were ready to listen, so that he could fit this church together? That I fit here as your pastor just as much as you fit here as one of the members? That this is God's building, that he's the one that put it together, that he's the one that went out and got all the various pieces and shaped them in such a way and providentially created their lives to happen in such a way that they would fit together at the time that they needed to fit? You see, we are fitly joined together. And that was the way God deals with his church. Every member of the body has a place in the overall structure for which it is specifically adapted. Every one of you have a job to do here. Every one of you fits for a specific reason. Every single one, and you were made by God to fit into this church to serve his purpose. That's why you're here. Now, there comes a time when sometimes people decide they don't want to be here anymore, and we've had that happen, and we'll probably have it happen again in the future. And if your part was to be the ear, if you were the hearing and you decided to leave, well, God will go find another ear. But He's the one that finds them, and He's the one that fits them and puts you into the church to do your job. Now, the next point that we see here is that the whole body is compacted. Our verse here says, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted. To compact something means to press it down and get all the air out of it. We used to see, we had some areas in the part of California that we lived in where they had what they called poof dirt that didn't compact very well. And if you tried to build on this stuff without compacting the soil, your house would sink in the soil. I mean, as soon as it rained, it would just look like the Titanic, just go down and finally break in half. I had to appraise some of those things. Okay, earth wasn't compacted right. But there was another house that I appraised one time that they hadn't compacted the soil well, and half of it was on a mountainous lot, and half the lot slid out from underneath the other half, and the house broke in half, and half of it went down the hill. It wasn't compacted. See, the church is to be compacted, pressed down, get rid of the air, compacted, made tight. Okay? Compact means to join or knit things firmly and tightly together, or to each other, to combine closely into a whole, to consolidate by close conjunction, to make things tight, to bring it together tight. Think about bones in a body. If you have bones in a body, right? If they don't fit closely together, they're going to work very well. If your knuckle joint connects to this part of your finger bone, but then this knuckle, there's 6 inches before you get to the next place, the finger's not going to work right. Things have to be tight. They have to be compacted. They have to be closely knit together, joined together. That's the picture that we're trying to get here. The whole body fitly joined and compacted. You see, tightly fit together, not just loosey-goosey. The Greek word that's rendered compacted in this verse is rendered knit together. Over in Colossians chapter 2, we can turn over there briefly. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 2 says that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love. That's the same word that's translated compacted. And in Colossians 2:19, it says, in not holding the head, from which all the body by joints and bands having nourishment ministered and knit together. Again, that's the word translated compacted over in Ephesians. Now to knit means to tie in with a knot, basically to tie in a knot. Tie something in a knot, that's to knit it. To tie, fasten, bind, attached, join, by as or by knotting, to conjoin as by knotting or binding together, to bind, join, or connect firmly, to unite or combine intimately. We're to be knit together, compacted, knit. Do you see the point at how close the members of the church are supposed to be? That we're not supposed to be every man for himself, that we are a body, and each part of the body should be as close to the other parts of the body as it would be in a body. You don't have your arm laying over on a table. Well, Diana did for a while, but you don't usually have your arm laying on a table over in the other part of the room. It's connected to you. The members of the church are to be connected to one another. And that includes the non-residents. We're to be connected to them. They are part of this body. So, if you feel like you're bound to this church, I've got news for you. You are. If you feel like you're tied down here, you should. You are tied down here. God tied you down here. Now, let's look at the contrast of this over in Psalms chapter 2. Psalms chapter 2, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, watch this, let us break their bands asunder. Let us cast away their cords from us. You see, a lot of people don't join a church because they don't want to be connected to it. They don't want to be tied down. They don't want to be tied to that church. Because in reality, if you belong to a church, you're tied to it. You should be. That's what the words mean. We're also told in Colossians 2:2 that we're knit together in love. Colossians 2 verse 2. That their hearts might be comforted being knit together in love. Now that's an important point. It's love that knits us together. Look at 1 John chapter 3. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16. Hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion for him, how dwelleth the love of God in him? You see, we're knit together in love. When we see one of our brethren suffering, we should do something about it. If we love that person, if part of your body is aching, do you not love your body enough to fix it? Do you not love it enough to put a bandage on it if you cut it open? If you're having problems with part of your physical body, do you not love your own body enough to take care of it? Do you not love the church well enough to take care of one of your brethren when they're struggling with something, when they're having a problem? It's the same thing. We're to watch out for each other. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is a passage that deals with charity. And charity by definition is Christian love. And by its very nature, it binds the members of a church together. Now let's see what this says about charity. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. This is how we're to be knit together. Picture this with the other members of the church. Doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own. You see, love doesn't seek its own. Hate does, but love doesn't seek its own. Love looks out and tries to take care of others before it tries to take care of itself. We're not supposed to be in here trying to take care of ourselves. Ourselves is what gets us into trouble most of the time. Being ourselves is the problem. We're supposed to be more like Christ. who laid down his life for us. And that's how we're to look at the other members of the church. That if they're struggling with something, we're to be there to help them, so however we can. And in a compacted body, the church members are close to one another. They're tightly connected to one another. So I've got to ask the question, are you tight with the church? I think most of the people in this room could say yes. Or since we're knit together in love, do you love the church? And you should be able to answer that in the affirmative. If you can't, then there's a problem. The next point, the whole body is fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth. Back to our verse in Ephesians. From whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth. And the joint under consideration is not something that you smoke. Okay? We're talking about the joints of the body. A joint is the place or part at which two things or parts are joined or fitted together. A junction, an arrangement, structure, or mechanism in an animal body whereby two bones or corresponding parts of an invertebrate animal are fitted together either rigidly or especially so as to move one upon another. That's a joint. The whole body is fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth. Each one of these members of the body fits together by a joint to another member of the body. It's like the old song, what, the hand bone's connected to the wrist bone, the foot bone's connected to the ear bone, something like that. You see, if you let me design the body, you're going to be in trouble. God does a better job. But each one of the members is joined at a joint to the other members of the church. That's how the church grows, is the fact that each one of the members joins another member and is tightly compacted, is firmly joined. Okay? The joint, okay, Colossians 2:19, and we read this, it says that all the body by joints and bands has nourishment ministered. All the body by joints and bands has nourishment ministered. A band is a connecting piece by which the parts of a complex thing are held firmly together. That's the definition of a band. Joints and bands correspond to the joints and the ligaments that connect the bones in the body. If you were to look at a skeleton, you would see that you have the bones, and then you have these bands called ligaments that attach to the bones that hold it all together. The church is much the same way, and the nourishment comes from those bands. A ligament is one of the numerous short bands of tough, flexible, fibrous tissue which bind the bones of the body together. It's the joints and the bands that hold the joints together, hold them in place. And we're told that all the body by joints and bands has nourishment ministered. The body is nourished by the supply of the joints and bands. In other words, the body is nourished through the members being connected one to another. If the members of the church are connected one to another, then the body is nourished. If the members of the church aren't connected to each other, then there's no nourishment. There's no way for the nourishment to flow through from one member to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And when you end up with a blank where someone's not connected, well, it has to go a different route. In order for you to grow spiritually, you have to be connected to the church. Do you not see that? You have to be part of the body. You have to be firmly connected if you want to grow. That's where the nourishment comes from. It's by means of the nourishment which every joint supplieth that the body is fitly joined together and compacted. Now look at that. The nourishment which every joint supplieth. There's nourishment comes from Christ into these joints and bands, but then it's up to the joints and bands to nourish downstream by being connected together. It takes all the members connected with each other and contributing their part for the body to be closely and tightly fitted together. We all have to do our part in this, whatever that part might be. And that's what makes us tightly connected. Your failure to do your part will weaken the overall compactness and connectedness of the church. This is one of the reasons that you'll find some churches out there that are just absolutely dead, because the people aren't connected to it. The people don't feel connected to it. They don't feel part of it. They just show up. But they don't do their part. And as a result of not doing their part, there's no connection. And if there's no connection, the church dies. The member that detaches himself from the rest and doesn't contribute to the body isn't fitly joined together. And there's a term for that. It's called a misfit. And some people just don't fit into a church. There are times when people, they just don't fit. They don't belong here. Now, there are times when sometimes they were designed to belong here, but they didn't want to, so they left. And sometimes there's people who just don't belong here. They just don't belong in the church. I want you to notice one other thing. That word, it says that we're joined and joined together. We keep going over this idea of being joined and joined together. That the body of Christ is something that we're joined to. Now, we're never commanded to join a church. You cannot find a commandment in the Scripture to join a church. It doesn't exist. It doesn't tell us to join a church. But there is a commandment over in Acts to be baptized. Acts chapter 2. Verse 38. Then Peter said unto them, Repent and be baptized every one of you in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. Now that repent and be baptized is in the imperative mood in grammar. And the imperative mood means it's a command. It's a commandment. It's like when you tell your kid to sit down and eat. That's a commandment. Quit playing with that. That's a commandment. My wife could probably rattle off a couple of them that she throws at me from time to time. And all I can do is say, yes, ma'am. And that's why we've been married for 28 years, almost. So you see, this is a commandment. It's a commandment of God that you be baptized. You say, well, what's that got to do with joining a church? Keep reading. Look at verse 41. Then they that gladly received his word were baptized. And the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. You say, okay, well, they were added, but what's that got to do with joining? Do you know what the definition of the word add means? The word add means to join or unite. You see, when they were baptized, they were joined to the church. That's how you're joined to the church. God never commanded you to join the church, but when you're baptized, you join the church. You're added to the church, and that means you're joined to it. And that's a direct commandment of God to be baptized. So if you've never been baptized, then you're disobeying a direct commandment of God. Because Peter said, repent and be baptized, every one of you. And they that gladly received his word were baptized. And that's how you're joined to a church. And therefore, when someone's added to the church, we rightly affirm that that person has joined the church. They've been added to it. another important point, and that is that if you've never joined a New Testament church, then the verses I'm going over right now don't really apply to you. You can't be compacted together with the other members of the church if you're outside the church. This is only for members, resident and non-resident, actual members of the church that have been baptized and are part of the church. They're the only ones that can be fitly joined together. This is directly speaking to them. The next part of the verse, let's look at it again. Ephesians chapter 4:16. From whom, and that was Christ, the whole body fitly joined together, we've looked at that, and compacted, we've seen what that means, by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part. The effectual working in the measure of every part. That means that every part of the body has a measure. Every part of the body has a certain amount that it contributes to the body. And I'm not talking about finances here. That's part, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the things that you do within the church, the part that you contribute to the church. Every member of the church has a part that they are to contribute to the church. Every member has something that they contribute. And no one part of the body contributes everything. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. First Corinthians chapter 12, verse 15. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? It's a silly question. Of course it's of the body. And if the ear shall say, because I am not the eye, am I not of the body? Is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? You see, each part of the body has a specific responsibility. It is not the responsibility of the ear to walk. That's the responsibility of the feet and the legs. It is not the responsibility of the hands to smell. That's the responsibility of the nose. Every part of the body has something that they specifically contribute to the whole body. And remember, the whole body under consideration here is the church. Every one of you have something that you have a duty to contribute to the church. Everybody does. And it's that contribution that you make that makes the church tighter and makes it compacted together. It's by the contributions that you make. And again, I'm not strictly talking financial. I'm talking about other contributions that everyone in this body has a responsibility to do. But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body as it hath pleased him. And if they were all one member, where were the body? We all can't be one thing. We're all a different part. But now are they many members, yet one body, and the eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of thee. Nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. Nay, much more those members of the body which seem to be more feeble are necessary. And that's true in a church. Sometimes the members of the church that seem to be the most feeble are the most necessary. That's just the way it works. I've got some examples, but I'm not going to say them out loud. Sometimes those that appear to be the most feeble are the most necessary. Just like in the human body. Sometimes the inner parts that aren't all that attractive. You know, I could live without a hand or an arm, or I could live without a face. Not that I'm saying my face is all that attractive, but I can't live without a heart. I can't live without a liver. I got to have lungs. Those are things I have to have. They're probably not the best looking, but the comely parts you can do without. It's those that you don't usually give that much honor to that are the most important. But everybody has a part. Now, the word effectual, this is an effectual working in the measure of every part. Effectual, which is something that produces its intended effect or adequately answers its purpose. That's what effectual means. The Greek word translated effectual working is actually the word from which we derive the English word energy. It's from where we get our energy. Notice that your part in the body has an intended effect. It has a purpose. Whatever your part that you play is, whatever it is that you contribute to the church, has a purpose. But the work you do must answer God's purpose if it's going to supply the nourishment to the body. It doesn't supply nourishment to the body if the part that you play isn't your part to play. If you try to do something that's not your job, then it's not going to nourish the body. Not everybody gets to be the preacher. No, but not everybody wants the job, and sometimes I'd be willing to trade. Not everybody has a job. This just happens to be where my lot fell, and we all have to bear our cross, right? So some people have different. Everybody has a different job. It's just you just have to find the right job so that what you are giving is so that you're energizing the body, so that what you are doing is effectual, so that it's an effectual work, that the effectual purpose is being met by the measure that was given to you to help nourish the body. So now comes the question, well, what's my part? How do I know what my part is? How do I know what I'm supposed to do? How do I know what my job is? Where do I find that? Turn to Galatians chapter 6. It is really very simple. The gentleman in the blue shirt has a term that he uses, doing the next best thing to do. It's much like that. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 says, "As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith." As we have opportunity. When you have the opportunity to do good, do good. Do whatever you can to help, especially to the people in the church. When you have the opportunity. If you don't have the opportunity, well then it's not required of you. But when you have the opportunity, then you do good to all men, especially those the house of faith. Now the other verse that we want to connect this with is found over in 1 Peter. Chapter 4 and verse 10. "As every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God." You see, if you've received this, in other words, if you have the ability and you have the opportunity, then you do good to all men, especially those of the house of God. If you don't have the ability, then you don't have the responsibility. Let's say you hear that somebody in the church is kind of down on their luck and could use some money, and you have some laying by your side. Just send it to them. Send it anonymously if you want to. Do good. If you don't have it, well then you're not required to do it. If you don't have the, sometimes you just find that you see someone that's not feeling very good, and you can tell that there's something bothering them. Go up and talk to them. This past week, I called our brother out in Nevada that is suffering with cancer. I'm not going to say his name on the tape, but I called just to check in with him. And I said to him, I hope you don't mind that I sick the church on you. And he commented on an email that he received from one of our members. Very nice email that was sent about some telephone calls that they'd received. He was absolutely tickled to death. That made his day. That helped him get through some more time, because some of the people here took from their own time and just said, hi, we're here. Sometimes just to hear that another person cares enough to say that we're thinking of you, we're praying for you. Sometimes that's enough. And many times what will then come back is they'll do something to build you back up again. That's all it takes. It's not a huge chore to go out of your way to walk across the hall and shake hands with somebody and let them know you care. That's really all I'm talking about here. Every one of us can do that. Every single one of us can care a little bit more about the other people than we do about ourselves. Remember charity? Charity is not selfish. Charity cares for others first, looks out for others first, and then the rest of us will be taken care of. If you have the ability and the opportunity, then do good. That's it. It's no more complicated than that. But every one of us have that responsibility. And in doing so, it compacts the church. It makes us tightly knit together. We receive the nourishment that we need to grow. That's how you grow a church. By being kind to one another, by caring for one another, by looking out for one another, by carrying everyone else's burdens along with you. Because I can guarantee you somebody's carrying yours, whether you know it or not. And somebody carried yours all the way to a cross and died on it for you. So the call is to be more like Christ and carry the burdens of others rather than simply worrying about ourselves. And in doing so, we build the church. So that's your part. Now, if you don't do your part, you actually end up draining the energy of the rest of the church. You know what it's like when you've got something going on within your physical body you've got a stomach ache, or you've got something that's hurting or aching, and it just drags the whole body down. Same thing happens in the church. If we have members that aren't doing their part, it drags down the whole church. That's why we admonish people. That's why we exhort people. That's why we warn people. That's why we work with people to try to get everybody on the same page so that we're working together. Okay? Now, the nourishment being supplied throughout the body by the connectedness of the members comes from Christ. Let's remember that. He's the one that nourishes the body. He's the head. Christ is the head. Now think of the physical body. What we need in order to survive, we need oxygen, we need food, we need water. Those are the things that we need to survive, and every one of those goes through the head. Right? You breathe through your nostrils and or your... I tend to breathe, if I'm asleep, through my mouth, which creates noise for the missus, but But it's the head that you breathe through and that you eat through and that you drink through, and it's the same picture with the church. The head is Christ. All of the nourishment comes from Christ. He's the one that we're to be hanging on to. He's the instrument that is used for the nourishment. And then it is then passed down to the different members through the joints and the bands because of the connectedness of the church. That's how a church is nourished. And again, if you're not joined or connected to the church, then you're not going to receive the nourishment. Notice also that this contribution that is made, it increases under the edifying of itself in love. We've read in this passage over in Colossians chapter 2:19, not holding the head, from which all the body by joints and bands, having nourishment ministered and knit together, increaseth with the increase of God. That's the increase that we want. We want the increase of God. That's what we're searching for. That's how we want to grow. Not merely in number. I'm going to show you here in a minute how you can grow a church overnight with people. How you can fill up a church overnight with people. If that's what you're looking for, I can show you how to do that. And I'll show you what will happen to it when you do. Okay? But we're looking for the increase of God. We want His increase. If we're God's church, we want His increase, not just man's increase. In a church that increases with the increase of God, edifies itself, it builds itself up in those spiritual qualities that benefit and strengthen and support itself. That's the increase we're looking for. An increase in numbers should only be sought so far as such increase strengthens the church spiritually. We don't merely want to add people. That's the last thing in the world we want to do, is add a bunch of people. Look at Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5 and verse 14. And believers were the more added to the Lord, multitudes both of men and women. We want to add believers to the church. We don't just want people. We want believers. We want God's children in the church. You bring a bunch of people in that aren't believers, well, they're not fit to the church. They're not going to be knit together. They're not going to be compacted. And if they're not compacted, they're just going to push the rest of us apart. You know, there is an increase to the body that can happen that's not necessarily good for the body. I had an increase in the body a few years ago. It's been 5 years ago now that they found an increase in my body called a cancer that was a tumor growing. But that's not good for the body. Yeah, it increases to the body. It's an increase, but it's not a good increase. And when you start just increasing in numbers and not looking out for believers and making sure that who you're increasing with, that increase can be detrimental to the body, not helpful to it. Let's consider the case of leaven. Look at Galatians chapter 5. Because this is another way that a church can grow and increase in numbers. But it's not a good increase. Galatians chapter 5. The letter to the Galatians was written because the Galatian church had started to drift into, for lack of a better term, Arminianism. They drifted into the idea that you had to do something in order to be saved. That Christ's sacrifice wasn't sufficient to do it. That you had to add something to it in order to be done. In order to get there, you had to do something yourself. That was the heresy that the Apostle Paul was dealing with when he wrote the letter of Galatians. And he says in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 9, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Just a little bit of leaven will leaven the whole lump. You take a lump of dough, next week we'll have communion. We will have unleavened bread laying over on the counter that'll end up on a plate, and each of the members will partake of that. Take a look at it. When you take the piece next week, take a look at it. Look at how tightly compacted that the particles of that bread are. There's no space between them. They're tightly compacted. Now, you go buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store, leavened bread at the grocery store, and it's a lot bigger. It looks bigger, right? You could take the same amount of dough and make unleavened bread with it, and then put a little bit of yeast in it, which is leaven, and bake that in another oven, and watch what happens. And you're going to have a very small, tightly compacted piece of unleavened bread on this side, and you're going to have a huge loaf of bread over here. It looks so much bigger, right? It's got growth to it, and then you slice it open, and what do you see? A whole bunch of holes. Because all the leaven did was create gas that blew the particles apart. And that's what happens in a church when you start preaching false doctrine like in the Galatians. You let a little false doctrine drift in here, you'll fill this room to the rafters. You start preaching what the world wants to hear, and we'll have to build a $7 million building. The world loves lies. If we start teaching lies, we'll get growth, but it's just air. And it's just gas that pushes the true believers apart. And that's not what we want. We don't want that kind of growth. You can have it. It's easy to get. How many churches are there here in Lakeland? 700 and something, I think, or in the greater area, 500, something. I mean, there's a bunch of churches out there preaching this stuff. They're filling the rooms up all the time, but you cut that loaf of bread open and all you're going to find is a bunch of gas and very, very little sound doctrine. That's not what we want. We want, or I don't know, maybe it's what you want, not what I want. I want something that's compacted together. I'm looking for that unleavened bread where the members of the church are all believers, striving together, working together, taking care of one another. That's the church of God. And that's the kind of church that people you would think would want to join. Because it's the one that they're all the time talking about how this church doesn't seem to care about anything but themselves. Well, that's not a real church. That church doesn't have the increase of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 6. We have much the same type of a statement regarding leaven. Your glorying is not good, know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? You see, you start to sprinkle a little of that doctrine in, and pretty soon, you'll get growth. But it's not the kind of growth you want. Now, we mentioned that the edifying is in love, and love is constructive. Whereas hate, the absence of love, is destructive. Okay? Remember that Christian love, charity, is something that's not selfish. It doesn't seek its own. It looks out for others. It takes care of others. You remember we read that passage? Turn over to 2 Timothy chapter 3, and I'll show you the opposite of that. And this is in a church. This passage is dealing with a church towards the last times. Okay? So we're talking about church people here. 2 Timothy chapter 3, this is the opposite of charity. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves. Exactly the opposite of charity. Covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. That's what you'll find in a leavened church. And that's not what we want. That's the opposite of what we want. Back to our passage in Ephesians. It says, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. This passage clearly sets forth interaction, mutual ministry among the members of the church. That's what it's talking about. As the members minister to one another, then their spiritual potential is maximized. Have you ever done something nice for somebody and you felt good afterwards? You felt strengthened afterwards? It might not have been anything big, but you did something. You went out of your way a little bit to help someone, and you walked away feeling nourished and feeling better about it. You ever had that I've had that happen. And sometimes it's one of those things where you just, I know I should do that, but I really don't want to. But then you go ahead and do it anyway, and afterwards you feel better for doing it. That's really what we're talking about. Pick up the phone and call somebody. Let them know that you care about them. Get to know some of the other members that are members of the church, that even though they're 2,000 miles away from us, they're still members of the church. Pick one and get into communication with them. Make them your friend. Find out who they are. Talk to them. And I'm admonishing those non-resident members out there to do the same thing. Get a hold of some of the people here. Connect with somebody. One of the worst things that we ever had to go through as non-resident members was never knowing what was going on at church. We never knew. We'd mention somebody to somebody and they say, oh, they were excluded 6 years ago. Well, we never knew. Nobody ever told us. We were completely disconnected except when we would get in a car and drive up there. Now that's something that I don't want to have happen here. So as a result, I have a newsletter. I haven't sent it out to the resident members. You don't need it. But I send it to all the non-resident members. It doesn't have much in it, but it's something just to let them know we're still here. And it's got phone numbers on it. And so I'm asking you to do likewise. Get to know those people. Reach out to them. Give them a call. How you doing? Anything we can help you with. Because they're members of the church too. And if we do that, you never know what might happen. You know what? You never know. God could open a door and move a whole bunch of them out here. You never know what God could do if we just reach out and do what we're supposed to do and not just live within these four walls. We have a bunch of other members out there that we should be in contact with. They're members too. Let's not forget that. And none of us are exempt from this mutual ministry. None of us. We all have this obligation. I know maybe you might think, well, it's hard for me to reach out to myself and do something like this. Well, again, yourself is the problem. You should reach out to yourself. You should get out of yourself. You'll never grow if you don't do something. Just reach out and get to know folks. I don't want people to think that, well, because I can't do what someone else can do, I won't do anything at all. That's the wrong approach also. Maybe you can't do what some of the other members can do, but you can do something. You have a talent. God gave you a gift, God had his, there's a lot of things that I would love to be able to do better than I do now. That's not my gift. I have certain things that I can do, and I try to do those, and then I also try to do other things that I'm uncomfortable doing. I'll tell you a real big one that I was uncomfortable doing for a long time. This. I was extremely uncomfortable doing this for years. I dreaded the idea of going to church because I was afraid that I'd get called on and have to preach. This was the worst thing in the world imaginable to me, was to stand up in front of a bunch of people and talk for 5 minutes. I would go to Wendy can tell you, I would head to the restroom and lose my breakfast if Conrad so much as looked in my direction, and I thought I was going to have to preach that day. And here I am doing it. And now I love it. So reach out to yourself. Maybe it is tough for you the first time, but once you do it once, it's not tough anymore. After a while, it becomes comfortable. Step out in faith. Believe that God will be there to help you get through it. And let's make the church compacted. Let's nourish it by making it firmly fit together. In order to grow, we have to be willing to minister to others. We have to be willing to look at others and say, okay, that brother's going through something. Maybe I can't really do much about it, but at least I can let him know that I care. And sometimes that's all it takes. You'd be amazed at some of the things that sometimes the littlest things that mean the most to some people. I have a little handmade birthday card tacked up on my bulletin board in my study, and you all know who made it. She's sitting back there in the back of the room. Just the thought of that helps you get through the next day. Sometimes it's just the smallest little things. Just walking up and shaking hands with somebody. Giving somebody a hug when you can tell they need it. Being kind to them. Letting them know you're there. Sometimes that's all it takes. And you get them through the next week. And that's what we're here to do, to get each other through the next week. But let's not forget that we got another 18 or 19 people out there that we need to try to help get through to the end of the week as well. So again, I'm asking you, reach out to those folks. You do a wonderful job here. Let's reach out to them. Let's make the experience for them as good as we can make it, because it's a tough experience. And I know, having been a non-resident member for as long as I was, I know how disconnected you can feel. I know how tough it can be. Wendy and I have only been resident members of a church since we moved here. We were baptized in 1987. Now, we spent 1 year in Las Vegas. And other than that, we were non-resident members from April of 1987 until we moved here in May of 2013. I know what it's like to be a non-resident member. And it's a whole world different to be a resident member. So let's not forget those folks out there. And let's remember that there's more to church than simply sitting through the service on Sunday. The church isn't a building for worship. We're not a building where the people just show up. The church is the people. It's the interaction of the people. That's the church, and it's not a theater where the worshipers just show up to watch the preacher perform. That's not what a real church is. I know there's a bunch of groups out there that call themselves churches, that's what they're designed to do, but that's not what it is. It's not a country club that's designed just for you to go have fun at once a week. It's a body that was created by God for mutual ministry so that His children could get through the week, so that they would have a place of refuge to run to leave the problems behind. Like Brother Rex says, to throw the armor in the corner for a couple hours. That's what the church is. That's what it's to be. And the only way it will grow is by us being connected together. And so with that, I thank you for your kind and patient attention this morning. And let's stand and sing number 1.